Hello and welcome to Battle of the Day. Today we look at the Battle of Waterloo and ask some important questions about the training of British cavalry in light of events on the 18th and about the wider significance of the battle as a whole. Now, joining me to discuss these issues are the renowned military affairs analyst Daniel Schuster and Lieutenant General Sir George Pearce, a former cavalry commander. Welcome both of you. What are your initial reactions to this news?
Well, this result is somewhat surprising, given that Napoleon held the initiative from the outset of the campaign. For 3 days the Allies were reacting to his actions, and it was only on the 18th that their strategy really began to come together.
And General Pearce, what do you attribute today's success to?
I think today's success can be attributed entirely down to the reforms of the Duke of York as enacted as head of the British Army. The new guidelines stipulating that one cannot advance to the rank of major until you've served as captain for 6 years has increased the professional expertise of our officers.
But if that is so, then how do we account for the catastrophic routing of the Union Brigade?
I think you're doing a great disservice to one of the most heroic acts in British military history here. The initial and devastating success of the Union Brigade deserves its proper recognition. It's only natural that after such a success, they would have had a further thirst for glory. War is rarely simplistic as armchair theorists suggest it is.
I'm not calling the gallantry of the British cavalry into question, but the British cavalry established a reputation for impetuosity during the Peninsular War, and events at Waterloo would suggest that nothing has changed.
War reforms take time to show their full merits. The new military academy for cavalry and staff officers at Sandhurst has only been open a few years. But we're drifting from my original point here, which is that this battle and the victory demonstrates the superior fighting qualities and training of the British Army, and more importantly,
I think General Pearce is actually doing a disservice to the French and Prussian armies here, Zach. I think we must not forget that Waterloo was not solely a British victory. If it wasn't for the errors of the French commanders and the good judgment of the Prussians, Wellington would never have made a stand at Mont Saint-Jean.
I feel you make a valid point, Dan. But I still think that this victory exemplifies yet again the superior quality of the British Army, which can be attributed to the reforms I have already mentioned, and more importantly, the tenacity of the men.
In what sense?
Well, the British Army's cohesion is not simply a case of many units working together under Wellington's command, but it's due to the superb relationship between officers and rankers. This relationship maintains discipline, and also there's the camaraderie at platoon level. Essentially, there's a system of moral values running through the British Army, which promotes masculine conduct, including courage and obedience.
Interesting, but Dan, you're looking sceptical.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the masculine values which General Pearce is referring to here are valued in all the armies across Europe, and his comments about motivation in particular could be applied to the French and Prussian armies. I think the decisive factor for the British Army was more the psychological boost of Wellington's presence. We've already seen this in the past. In 1813, at the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington's mere arrival on the battlefield brought rousing cheers from the British and Portuguese troops.
And what are both of your assessments about the value of the Prussians here?
Well, there can be no questions that the contribution of the Prussians was vital. If the Prussians had not carefully managed their retreat to Wavre and then withdrawn instead along their lines of communication with Germany, there would never have been a battle at Waterloo, because Wellington would have withdrawn and abandoned Brussels.
I agree that Prussian assistance was crucial. We should not forget that they engaged a whole corps on Napoleon's right flank, keeping them from engaging the British and Dutch. I still maintain, however, that it was the tenacity of the troops, British KGL and in some cases Dutch, which was crucial to victory. If Wellington's army had not held the line, Blucher's decision to come and support him would have been irrelevant, and we would now be sat here discussing Napoleon's latest crushing victory.
So ultimately, how important is Waterloo? Let us suppose for a moment that Napoleon had won. Dan, is it really even realistic to make such a suggestion?
Well, Napoleon certainly had a chance at Waterloo. I mean, there were so many situations which could have gone either way. To name a few: Hougomont, Ney's headlong charges, the total absence of Grouchy at the time of the arrival of the Prussians. There was even the weather, with the wet weather nullifying the French artillery.
Okay, I get the impression that we could go on for a while here. General Pearce, what do you feel was the decisive turning point at Waterloo which could have led to a French victory?
For me, I feel it arrived a few days earlier at Quatre Bras-Ligny. A more comprehensive French victory here would have meant Wellington was much less willing to offer battle. But a failure to achieve this result showed that Napoleon's plan of splitting the Allies and defeating them in turn was failing.
But Dan, once again, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, well, personally I'm intrigued with the total collapse of the French army which followed the failure of the Imperial Guard. Whilst the commitment of the Guard was undoubtedly a final roll of the dice, if they had succeeded in breaking through the British lines, we might not be sitting here together now.
And again, hypothetically speaking, how would Wellington's reputation have suffered from a defeat at Waterloo?
There can be no question, Zach. Wellington would have been remembered for his victories in the Peninsula campaign. However, I don't think any political ambitions he held would have been accomplished.
I think you're being far too generous. Wellington won many victories in the Peninsula, but a defeat at Waterloo would have destroyed that reputation. I think the Peninsula campaign was merely a sideshow for many in Britain. It failed to capture the hearts and minds of the Whigs in particular. What is more, Wellington would not have had the chance to redeem himself, as the fate of Europe would have been left to the mainland powers.
Oh, but you're forgetting that Wellington himself has said that if he was forced to withdraw, he merely would have withdrawn to the Bois de Soignes in the rear of his position.
Okay, sadly we have to stop our discussion there for today. General Pearce, I believe you're staying with us. Daniel Schuster, thank you very much for joining me. Now, we've been inundated by viewers' comments about the battle. Captain John Kincaid, who's serving with the 95th Rifles, says the presence of Wellington on the battlefield cannot be overstated. I'd rather see his long nose in a fight than a reinforcement of 10,000 men any day. Meanwhile, Napoleon's brother Lucien has taken to Facebook to say that the war is far from over if his brother dares to believe. However, Napoleon himself has replied in a tweet that he's dead only too much already, and this already looks likely to become the most retweeted comment this century. Now, joining me to discuss some of the issues raised by our viewers are General Pearce, Bobby Whitworth, editor of the Southampton Gazette, and Patrick Thulis, MP for Hamptonshire South. Welcome all of you. Let us begin with the political reaction. How has news of Waterloo been received within Parliament?
Well, the British government is clearly delighted that Wellington has once again secured a glorious victory, which will be remembered for centuries to come. The British Army has once again excelled under Wellington's guidance, and it serves to highlight to the world the instrumental role which Wellington's had.
Here.
I don't think there is any question that this victory demonstrates the prowess of the British Army, but I think Wellington would resent the suggestion that the British government has been consistent of its execution of the war against Napoleon. He lamented and at times mocked the government for being too hesitant in their support of him during the Peninsular War.
Well, yes, but in 1810 and 1811, both political and strategic situations were different, which meant that...
But regardless, the British government's dedication to the struggle has not always been consistent and wholehearted, and I would suggest that the only reason that the Whigs have given up criticising the Duke is because his reputation is so flawless.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. General Pearce, what do we think about the popular reaction to Waterloo?
I've personally been quite surprised. While there has been celebration, it's been a lot more muted than at previous Wellington victories. For example, Salamanca or Vittoria.
Well, the circumstances are very different from the Peninsular victories, largely due to geography. During the Peninsular War, the papers would have been weeks for certain news, which led to a rife culture of rumour and counter-rumour. With Waterloo, news was spreading in London by the 20th.
We must be fair here, though. We must not forget that crowds did follow the captured French eagles as they were carried through the capital, even if those crowds didn't then go on to throw stones at the windows of those who opposed war, as they'd done previously.
That's true. In fact, the response has been generally more muted than one might have expected. In Paris, for example, there are rumours that the monarchists are becoming increasingly bold, but there is no means by any indication that a mass revolution will sweep Napoleon from power.
But is that not surprising, given that Napoleon's plans for the 100 days have now failed so spectacularly?
Actually, I have it from sources in French High Command that Napoleon can still call upon 96,000 troops posted throughout France. If he could combine these with the army in Alsace-Lorraine and with depot and National Guard troops, he could still pose a potent threat to forces advancing from Belgium.
Absolutely. And in fact, some are even suggesting that it may be more prudent for Wellington and Blucher to delay the advance into France and allow the Austrians and Russians to finish concentrating on the Rhine, although I do imagine it will be left to Wellington's discretion to make the final decision.
Of course. Now, a news viewer from Southampton asked, surely Napoleon's defeat was inevitable, given that a coalition consisting of Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia was massing against him. Do we feel that the coalition could have withstood a defeat at Waterloo?
I feel it is more a question of could the political forces holding these armies together have withstood such a test of their nerve. The Prussians had already suffered yet another bloody nose at Ligny. It is hardly likely that their morale would have been high, whilst the Austrians and the Russians marching across Europe to duel with the resurgent emperor could have been defeated in turn.
I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here, though. The forces opposing Napoleon were enormous. The French army at Waterloo numbered around 100,000. even if both the Russian and the Austrian armies, even if they engaged Napoleon one at a time, would still outnumber that force. I think it is more than possible that the French could have suffered a second Leipzig, essentially a result more catastrophic than Waterloo.
No, but you're forgetting the French garrison at Paris. Even after Waterloo, Napoleon could still call upon substantial resources.
So, however unlikely, if terms had been dictated by the French, what sort of future would Europe now be facing?
I think Napoleon's position in France would have been much more secure. However, even if he had somehow defeated the Austrians and the Russians, I doubt he or the French people would have forgotten the winter of 1812. So I cannot envisage him another crusade into Eastern Europe. Consolidation of his power would definitely have been the aim.
Talking in far too logical terms here, Napoleon was an immensely ambitious man. If you look at it, a military victory over Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia would have left Napoleon master of Europe and Britain completely exposed to invasion. In my opinion, I think that Britain would have needed to have mustered another Nelson to prevent domination.
And we end tonight with a comment from Private William Wheeler, who's serving with the 51st Light Infantry, which says, "If ever Britain should have need of her army again, and I should be with it, let us have Old Nosey to command." Patrick, what do you feel the future holds for Wellington? Will this be his last battle?
It's difficult to be sure of at this point, as everything depends on whether Napoleon attempts to continue war. However, there is certainly no desire within the government to dispatch him to America.
Yeah, his position in politics is difficult to predict for the coming years, but it is possible that he will occupy a prominent position in government. However, I think we can confidently predict that he will ultimately become Commander-in-Chief.
Okay, General Pearce, Poppy Whitworth, Patrick Theos, thank you very much for joining me. And sadly, that's all we have time for on today's show, bringing us to the end of our coverage here on BBC Battles. A big thank you to all of my guests, but most importantly, thank you for watching. Until next time, good night.